In this program, Martin Davies engages Davidson in a thorough discussion of his doctrine of anomalous monism and of the argument for it that he gave in his celebrated paper, Mental Events. He focuses mainly on the premise of the anomalism of the mental, leaving the discussion of the premise of the nomological character of causality to the program featuring Nancy Cartwright. For a thorough exploration of objections to anomalous monism, see the discussion with Tim Crane. This session opens with my questions to Davidson about the genesis of the ideas presented in the paper Mental Events. Davidson describes what motivated his arguments and which philosophers influenced him at the time. Davies begins his series of questions about anomalous monism by asking Davidson to explain in what sense it is a claim of monism. Davidson responds that it is the view that there is only one kind of thing, where thing is to be construed broadly to include both substances and events, and that this one kind of thing is physical. Davidson next explains the anomalousness part of anomalous monism. The anomalousness claim is that there are no strict laws that connect events described in physical vocabulary with events described in the mental vocabulary. And Davidson adds that this is intended to be conceptual, not an empirical fact about the mental. As well as thinking that there are no strict psychophysical laws, Davidson thinks that there are no strict psychological laws, and he discusses the connection between these two claims. Davies invites Davidson to say what he thinks makes for the difference between the mental and the physical realms. It is suggested that the real difference between the mental and the physical realms stems from Davidson's premise of the anomalism of the mental, the claim that there are no strict laws on the basis of which mental events can be predicted and explained. The rest of the session is devoted to Davidson's defense of this principle. Davidson remarks that since he wrote Mental Events, his arguments for the anomalism of the mental have changed somewhat, and that he now has three different, though related arguments. The first two are discussed at length in this program, but shortage of time prevented the third argument from being voiced. In brief summary, the third is essentially this. In applying mental concepts, our standards cannot in general be questioned, unlike our standards for applying physical concepts. Our knowledge of other minds is the basis of our concept of objectivity, that is, our recognition of a distinction between true and false belief. However, possession of this concept of objectivity is itself required for propositional thought to be possible. Therefore, to question the standards of application of our mental concepts, we would have to question our standard of objectivity. But this cannot be done, since the standard of objectivity is the ultimate one against which all other standards are measured and compared. Questioning our standard of objectivity would be as senseless as questioning the length of the standard meter bar. The session ends with a discussion of the difference in character between psychological and physical explanations. Both kinds of explanation are causal, but Davidson holds that many psychological explanations, in addition, have an element of reasonableness to them, that no physical explanations have such an element of reasonableness. However, he observed that not all psychological explanations can have this added character of reasonableness, for otherwise there would be no accounting for irrationality. We now join the discussion at the London School of Economics. Professor Davidson, today's topic of discussion centers around the famous and now infamous paper, Mental Events, which you wrote in 1970. I wonder if you could actually give us some sort of idea of the flavor of the times. What was it that actually possessed you to write that particular paper at that particular time? I'm trying to get some sort of a historical context to why you wrote that paper.
It's hard for me to connect the writing of a paper with anything particular that was going on then. In general, I think I very seldom have written papers that were designed to fit in with what people were interested in at the time. It was rather a matter of problems that presented themselves to me as a result of things I had done before. since I was, there were two areas in which I've been working. One was philosophy of action, and the other was philosophy of language. And these two came together at many points in my career, but this was one of them. I had claimed in earlier papers that things that we think and want cause what we do. They also explain it in special ways, but the relation is, among other things, causal. And many people thought, and in fact I was concerned about this, how can mental events cause physical events? Or the other way around, for that matter, since it's obvious that physical events cause mental events. Whenever we look and see something, something we naturally describe in physical terms most of the time, cause us to believe things or notice things. So I wondered how can these two sorts of things interact? And at the same time, I was convinced, along with many other people, that the concepts we use to describe beliefs, desires, and other mental states, and the concepts, for that matter, that we use to describe intentional actions, aren't reducible to physical, the kind of vocabulary that one gets in the natural sciences. So this presented me with a puzzle, and I suppose that my prejudices were always monistic, that is, that there's only one kind of substance. And in fact, I found it hard to believe that there could be causal relations between two completely different sorts of substance. And in some sense, the physical world seems complete in itself. If you want to predict, explain, describe physical events, it seems as though everything that affects them can be described in physical terms. So these are the sorts of issues that I was concerned with.
You mentioned that there were other influences at the time. Would you mention a bit about some of the other players who were discussing the issues? I'm thinking sort of principally about, you mentioned in one of our discussions off camera about Stuart Hampshire and Elizabeth Anscombe at the time had influenced your thinking in action theory at that time.
Well, yes, that goes back to the beginning, really, of my publishing, and an intermediate event was that a student, a graduate student of mine, named Dan Bennett, not to be confused with several other people, while he was writing his dissertation, went to England and came back to Stanford, where I was teaching then, filled with the sorts of things that were going on at Oxford at the time. And Stuart Hampshire's thought and action and Anscombe's intention had come out during that period. And I became interested in his dissertation as I did in everybody's dissertation. I mean, I always sort of got fascinated with whatever people were grappling with. And there was this Wittgensteinian line, which everybody, or many people in England anyway, were buying at the time, which argued that the reasons why people act, let's boil that down for simplicity's sake to beliefs and desires, the reasons that they have in acting can't be causes of the actions, because there are clear logical relations between the descriptions of the contents of beliefs and desires and the way in which we describe the intentional actions that they explain. And people thought they had learned from Wittgenstein, or even from Hume, if there's a logical relation, it can't be causal, because Hume had taught us that causal relations are contingent. And I thought there had to be a mistake in that reasoning, and that really is what got me started. In actions, reasons, and causes was an outcome of trying to reconcile all the things I thought they had right with what I thought had to go with that, and that is the causal relations between reasons and actions. So this went into mental events, because here again I was asking how can there be causal. It's a slightly different problem, but in the same area. How can we explain the fact that there are causal relations between things that seem to belong to such different domains?
I want to just pick up another point, just to cover the sort of complete the historical part of this. If I recollect correctly, the paper starts out with a mention of Kant, and that there was, in a sense, a need to preserve agency. This has also seemed to be something that has run as a theme throughout your work, the sense of preserving human agency. That's something that is not to be entirely explicated in the closed system of physics. That's something that you begin in mental events with, and you end mental events with, returning back, and you hope that you've helped to shed some light on, or some way going some way towards solving Kant's problem. Had you closely studied this issue in Kant, or was it just that that was the immediate historical antecedent that you picked up?
I'm afraid the latter is the truth. And this has happened to me quite often. That is, having come to something through a course of worry and thinking, and arrived at some way of thinking about it, I then remember, or somebody reminds me, good heavens, somebody else had something to say about this. And so then I go back, read through Kant, read through the Critique of Practical Reason, which I must say was not on the agenda when I was a graduate student, so it was new to me. And I was surprised at what I found there. I said, wow, this is great. Kant says, on the one hand, something like determinism has to hold. On the other hand, we're free to act as we please. How can these... Well, the first thing is to realize both of those things are right. And now we have... So any philosophical view that contradicts either of those must be wrong. So I was... I certainly better put Kant in here because he belongs here. But it wasn't as though I was reading Kant and trying to solve his problem.
Just one final bit that I'd like to cover with you on setting the historical background to the paper before we take up the actual theses that are presented in it. What about the sort of the legacy of behaviorism, thinking specifically of Gilbert Ryle's work at that time? What about the sort of the strong physicalist legacy in the case of David Lewis's work at the time? Was that an influence directly on you, or not so much?
Oh, well, certainly not Lewis. You say at the time, I guess I didn't even know that David Lewis was onto that sort of thing in 1970. Is that right? Well, anyway, Ryle, I certainly had read Ryle, with care. He's only a behaviorist in a very special sense, it seems to me. One element in behaviorism was always straightforward reduction. Let's get rid of notions like belief, desire, intention, and so forth, and rather just talk about the things we observe people doing in a neutral vocabulary that doesn't use any of those mentalistic terms. Now, if I remember, Ryle isn't into that kind of reduction at all. So it's true that he wanted to get rid of a lot of machinery that many philosophers and psychologists had thought they needed. These internal gears turning, where the only evidence for it is what results. But he didn't try to describe what results without using ordinary mentalistic vocabulary. I think Ryle had some influence, though not even the kind of mild reductionism that you found in Ryle as for reducing things like beliefs to dispositions and so forth. That has never featured in my work.
To take up the theme of anomalous monism, I'm now going to be joined by Martin Davies, who is Wild Reader in mental philosophy at Oxford University and Professor of Philosophy at Oxford University. Martin.
Hello, Martin.
Hello, Donald. Thanks so much, Rudy. Well, if there was going to be a competition for the most discussed philosophical argument in the last 25 years, I suppose that the argument in the first few pages of Mental Events would be a strong contender for that title. It's a very simple argument in a way, superficially, just three premises and the conclusion which evidently follows. But it hasn't proved simple to understand. So I wondered if we might start out by you're just saying what the doctrine is, what the conclusion of the argument is. Can we do that in two chunks? It's a doctrine of anomalous monism. Can we just do the monism part? In what sense is the conclusion a claim of monism?
It's a claim that there aren't two different kinds of substance. Everything is physical, but that doesn't exclude many of those things being mental. We've got many ways of describing the same things, but this is a particularly important case of a dual vocabulary, and so the basic idea is quite clearly the same as Spinoza. One sort of substance. You can think about it, describe it, explain it in physical terms. You can explain it, describe it in mentalistic terms. These don't conflict with each other. They're just alternatives. And we couldn't, this is not part of the thesis of anomalous monism, but it's a thesis of mine. We couldn't get along without both. Nothing would constitute a way of thinking about the world that didn't contain both of these elements.
The monism, which is opposed to substance dualism, is part of the claim, but it would be we wouldn't characterize your view correctly if we said that the monism amounted to a monism about substance which could participate in radically different kinds of events, physical events on the one hand and mental events on the other hand. That wouldn't get the position quite right.
Oh, you mean because there still would be two different kinds of events?
The thought is that
Yeah.
the monism here involves this claim that every mental event is, as a matter of fact, the very same
Yeah.
thing, the very same particular thing as a physical event.
That's right. The ontology includes events, objects, as we say, and events, and the monism certainly applies to both.
So if we're thinking about who would be wrong if you were right on this monism point, then there'd be a range of different views. I wondered if I might just sketch 2 or 3 of them, just so that we can have them on a back burner in case it proves illuminating to mention them later. One kind of view which would be, I guess, wrong if you're right, is a view which says that there are mental events and there are physical events, and mental events are somehow composed out of or constituted by physical events, though not identical with them. So we're familiar with these constitution claims in other areas of philosophy, where you have an is of constitution, which is not the is of identity. Another kind of view, perhaps, would be the view that says that there are physical goings-on, there are mental occurrences, but that there's just no way, in principle, to tell how much of the physical goings-on we should seek to put a lasso around as a kind of candidate for identity with the mental occurrence. And then there'd be, I guess, a third sort of view, which wouldn't quite deserve the title of a dualism about events either, but rather would be the view that somehow the question of identity between mental and physical events doesn't make sense. And that would be the view that there's a scheme, a conceptual scheme, a kind of discourse or way of going on about mental matters. There's another scheme, way of going on about physical matters. We understand identity questions well enough within the mental scheme. We understand identity questions well enough within the physical scheme, but there's no stance or no point that we can stand upon in order to raise the question of identity across the schemes. Now, was any of those views explicitly or lying in the back of your mind as a target for the argument in the mental events paper?
No. And in fact, some of those suggestions may or perhaps ought to prompt some softening of the doctrine of anomalous monism. I'm not sure about the vagueness of boundaries of events. It seems to me there are certainly questions about how much space, so to speak, an event is taking up. The time element is not so hard to deal with. The same sort of question arises with respect to physical objects. Where does a river exactly end, or where does it exactly begin? We don't feel any great need to decide that, or how many square miles does Kilimanjaro take up? Well, where does it leave off exactly? And in fact, I mean, all kinds of questions can be raised if you want to get worried about it. Does it get bigger when there's more snow on it, or is the mountain itself still the same size? Who cares? And I think events are the same way. We don't know exactly where to draw the boundaries. We can, if need arises, we can decide these things, just as we could decide, I guess, in the case of a mountain, one way or another. And even counting becomes difficult. Take some area where how many mountains are there? Is Kilimanjaro really 2 mountains? It has 2 peaks, or is it just 1 mountain with 2 peaks? Well, yeah, again, we just decide. It's arbitrary, and I think all of these things go for events also.
The questions about vagueness, I think we might hold to one side. Perhaps the view which we might keep a little bit in mind is the possible position which says that even after all questions of boundaries have been settled to the extent that they need to be, still it's not quite right to say that the mental event is identical with the physical event, but they stand in some other rather intimate relation, which might be a little bit like the relation that a lump of bronze can stand in to a statue, for example. People think this is not the identity relation, but clearly the lump of bronze is taking up just about the same space at any given time as the statue, so it's a very intimate sort of relationship. I wonder whether that view as something which would be strictly speaking incompatible with the monism of the mental events paper might be kept as a possible focus for later discussion.
Well, I wonder. The case of the statue and the lump of bronze, it's clear enough why people want to make a distinction, because one of them lasts longer than the other. And it's not as though this puzzles us in some way. They're not identical. Well, neither am I identical with me just between the ages of 1 and 2, because one lasted a little longer than the other. If somebody were to say, well, there's a period during which the lump of bronze and the statue are identical, and then there's a period when they're not. Probably something rather analogous to that could be said about events, but again, I don't see how it touches the identity theory. I'm certainly willing to say, I guess insist, the question exactly what physical event is the same as my noticing that glass of water. It seems to me something that we can't easily settle, but that the mental event is identical with some physical event seems to me all that I'm really interested in maintaining. But it does seem to me, if all the neurological things that are going on inside of me weren't the way they are, then I certainly wouldn't be noticing what I am or thinking what I am.
Well, the monism of substance wouldn't quite exhaust the content of the monism in the conclusion of the argument in mental events, would it? Because there's something more, something about the events themselves, something along the lines that it wouldn't be right to think that there were mental events and these were completely other than physical events.
Quite right. Yes. My ontology of particulars in this world includes both objects and events, and the monism goes for both.
So the conclusion of the argument is going to be that every mental occurrence, every dated mental event, is the same particular thing as a physical event.
Some physical event.
Some physical event. And that's the monism. And now perhaps we come to the harder part of the doctrine, the anomalousness.
Right.
So anomalous monism, what is that?
It's the claim that there are no strict laws that connect events, or objects for that matter, described in the physical vocabulary, and those same events or objects described in the mental vocabulary. No systematic and highly accurate way of translating from one to the other is or could be available. That is, it's not just an empirical difficulty, according to my views. It's a conceptual difficulty.
In the paper, you say that the doctrine of the anomalism of the mental is that there are no strict deterministic laws, as you say, on the basis of which mental events can be predicted and explained. And on the face of it, one might think that one candidate for laws on the basis of which mental events might be predicted and explained would be psychological laws. And what you explicitly address is the claim that there are no strict psychophysical laws. Could you just say a little word, it's a relatively small issue, but just to clarify, what the relationship is between the no psychophysical laws and the no psychological laws claims?
Right. Yes, certainly the two claims are related to each other.
Surely.
The no psychophysical laws, well, no strict ones. There are certainly some pretty good ones if you make allowances for the necessary ceteris paribus clauses. In fact, that's where psychology as a separate science began, with discovering psychophysical regularities, and I don't mind calling them laws, in the 19th century. The psychologists who were working on that thought of themselves as addressing a problem in philosophy, namely, what's the relation between the mental and the physical? Let's find out and be serious about it. And there were these endless and very rewarding experiments in which responses to brightnesses of light, loudnesses of sound, and so forth were tested with extraordinary results, or at least they still astonish me. Just to mention one of them, somebody tried exposing people to two fixed tones and giving them a third tone which they could adjust, and saying, now please put the third tone halfway in between the other two. And it always seemed to me that you wouldn't even understand the question. What am I really trying to do? Halfway in between? What could that mean? Nevertheless, people do it. All right? I mean, they decide. And you can ask them this question over and over again with different fixed tones, and you get a scale, an interval scale, and you get predictions, because if you ask, well, is this halfway between this and this? Yes. Is this halfway between these two, as between your halfway mark before and the other fixed tone? Yes. And you just start asking more and more of these questions. You could then say, well, now they ought to say that this tone is halfway between these two, and they do. Astonishing. So there is a real scale, and this is serious scaling. You could axiomatize and of course all sorts of things like our decibel scale is based on that. And again, it's astonishing. I mean, this sounds twice as loud as that. That's what the decibel scale is, the psychophysical scale. And those are laws, all right, but of course they hold only if you keep a lot of things steady.
Sure. So we're going to have the idea, I'm sure it'll come up later, of laws which have to be stated in an all else equal form. But
Right.
just going back to the question of the psychophysical and the psychological, one way that I sometimes found it helpful to think about this is that if there were strict psychophysical laws, then given the background assumption that there are already strict physical laws, we could, so to speak, compose those laws together.
Of course.
And then you'd get a strict psychological law. So that seems to mean that no strict psychological laws entails no strict psychophysical laws.
That's right.
But how would you argue the entailment in the other direction, from no strict psychophysical to no strict psychological?
I don't think one just falls out from the other. There have to be separate arguments, though once you give them, they're going to sound very much like the others. We have psychological laws. I mean, ones that I would be willing to take fairly seriously, like let's say the transitivity of preference. If you prefer A to B and B to C, then you prefer A to C. That's often viewed as a normative law, but it also can be thought of as a descriptive law. In fact, I think the axioms of decision theory are pretty good as descriptive laws in properly controlled situations. Why do these fall short of being strict? Because the situations have to be controlled in all sorts of ways, and there's no list of things you have to keep steady. If the laws of decision theory hold, they don't, except loosely, predict what people are going to do, because they change their minds, they change their values, they change their beliefs, given input from the world or just living. The thing is, you can't list all the controls that you need in order for this to work. So I mean, that's why I think there can't be pure psychological laws. There's just too many things that interfere from the outside that psychology is not concerned with directly.
Yes. But running quite close to the part of the text of the paper where you discuss the difference between homonomic and heteronomic generalizations. Now, as I read this, it goes something like this, that in the physical arena, we often use generalizations which are not themselves strict. In the paper, you talked about rude rules of thumb, but that these generalizations, though not themselves strict, can be made stricter, ultimately can be made perfectly strict, perhaps, by drawing upon more concepts from the same field, so to speak, from the physical arena. And the contrast, I take it, is that in the case of psychological generalizations, to be sure, we have rude rules of thumb, which perhaps now you're prepared to say are laws and non-strict laws, but that these are different from physical generalizations because presumably they can't be made increasingly strict by drawing on concepts from the same conceptual domain. They can only be made strict by shifting vocabulary, you say. So perhaps we could have an example of a physical law. There might be a law which links electric charge to acceleration. And we'd say this is not strict because for any two charged bodies, you won't get a completely adequate account of the acceleration just by looking at the charges. You'll also have to look at masses because there are gravitational forces as well. So would the thought be that if somebody gave a ceteris paribus or all else equal generalization about charge and acceleration, that this would count as homonomic because it could be made more precise. One could give a more precise account of acceleration by drawing upon further concepts from the same field where mass gets to count as being in the same field as charge. What's the criterion of same field that's in play here? The concept of same field it can only be described in a circular way. The idea is the ideal of physics is to find a vocabulary which is complete in the sense that whatever you can describe in that vocabulary, you can explain in that vocabulary, and the pressure on physics is to find that vocabulary. But here there's a little hand waving. I mean, it's not as though we've got it. But the point is, that's what we're after in physics. That's what physics is the hunt for a vocabulary which is self-contained and will give you a closed set of laws. You've got a closed system in the sense that nothing interferes from the outside. I mean, so it's in one sense it's like going from Kepler to Galileo. Kepler's got a pretty good description of
pretty good one, of how the planets go around the sun and the moon goes around the Earth. But nothing to say if something comes in from outside. But given the theory of gravity, we not only explain Kepler, but we also see what would happen if something came in from outside. So that's about the level of my science.
Well, I'm sure you're 3 steps ahead of me on that, Donald, but perhaps we could just ask a little bit more about the notion of strictness. Sometimes when people talk about strictness in the physical sciences, they have in mind not that one may need to look at other influences coming in from the side, so to speak, but that one may need to look, shall we say, further down. And sometimes the idea is around that strictness only really belongs in the most fundamental physics, whatever that finally turns out to be. Now, is your use of the notion of strictness just like that? If it's followed to its logical conclusion, would you be bound to say that the only place where there are strict laws is in fundamental physics?
Yes, I would say that. Fundamental physics as we dream of it.
To be sure. So strictness is not something which marks out the physical sciences in general, including, as it might be, chemistry, from matters psychological.
Absolutely, yeah. Yes, the natural sciences are full of laws, which we couldn't do without, but which are not strict at all. I think geology, biology, endless things that we call natural sciences are meteorology. Good, let's take that. Our ability to predict the weather is nowhere near as good as our ability to predict most of the things that people are going to do. And yet, we don't doubt for a second that everything that happens in meteorology is explainable by fundamental physics. But we don't even dream of ultimately predicting the weather on the basis of knowing where every photon and electron is going.
The example of the meteorology that you mentioned, as far as I can see, you said that any meteorological occurrence could be explained in terms of fundamental physics, but of course it wouldn't be explained under its meteorological description.
Right.
And in a rather similar way, one might think even somebody who thought that every psychological occurrence could somehow be explained in terms of fundamental physics, they'd say, but of course not explained under the psychological description.
Right.
So far we haven't, I think, gotten to the heart of the issue, because meteorology belongs on the side of the physical sciences, and the point is that psychology is supposed not to. So I wonder if we might, just at this point, lay out the argument very briefly and then focus in upon what is perhaps the most complicated premise to defend.
Right.
So there are 3 premises, as I understand it. One is that mental events and physical events stand in causal relations. I have a very simple example. There's a balloon. It explodes. There's a loud bang. It's a physical event. Somebody in the room comes to believe there's been an explosion. Having a standing desire not to be around when there are explosions, or to having a standing tendency to be frightened, forms the intention, reaches the decision to run away. Running from the room, knocks over a vase, another physical event. So we start off with a physical event, we have a mental event, coming to believe something, another mental event, deciding something, person runs away, knocks over a vase, another physical event. Mental and physical interact with each other. First premise. Second premise, wherever there's causal interaction, there is a covering law which has to be strict.
Yes.
Third premise, in the mental arena and between the mental and the physical arena, there are no such strict covering laws. Therefore, conclusion, the mental events must themselves be physical events. But all that is to be consistent with the fact that although the mental is the physical, monism,
right,
nevertheless, there are no mental to physical laws, anomalous monism. So a lot is pivoting on the claim that there are no strict deterministic laws on the basis of which mental events can be predicted and explained. And that's not very far away from the idea that there are no strict psychophysical laws. So perhaps we ought to try to focus on just why you think that that can be used as a premise.
Yes. Well, let me just go back a little to the motivation for writing the article. Here were three things which I believed. I was convinced of the definitional and nomological irreducibility of mental concepts to physical concepts, whatever those physical concepts were. I was convinced there were causal relations between the mental and physical both ways, and I was convinced of a sort of regularity theory of causality, that where there's cause and effect, there is somewhere a law that will connect those two events. Now, these, I believe all three of these, and they seem to lead to a contradiction. On the surface of it, anyway, it looks like a straightforward contradiction. Interestingly enough, I think they seem to lead to a contradiction in Spinoza too, who also had he was an anomalous monist. I thought it would be of interest to people who didn't accept the premises to see that the premises were consistent with each other, and furthermore, if you accepted them all, you'd have a proof of monism. So I thought you could be interested in this, whether you accepted the premises or not. And in the original essay, I did almost nothing to defend the first two premises. And I mean, I just said, well, the first one looks so obvious to me that I'm just going to work with it, namely causal relations between the mental and the physical. I mean, our intentions and so forth change the world. And the world changes us, what we think. I gave some arguments, the best I could think of then, for the anomalous character, that is the failure of reduction, either nomological or definitional. And I didn't give any arguments at all for the second premise, just saying, well, a lot of people thought this is true of Kant and Hume, much as they differed on everything else, agreed on this, and so have many other people. But I knew, of course, some people didn't agree. More recently, I've tried to produce arguments for that. How good they are, I guess we'll discuss in another session.
Sure. Might we go to the argument for the anomalism of the mental? You say at one point in the paper there's no strict psychophysical laws because of the what you call disparate commitments of the mental and physical schemes. One has a sense that lurking right there is the key to this.
Yes.
And there's an example that you give. You say that in both the mental and the physical schemes, there are overarching principles. One might call them constitutive principles.
Right.
For example, in the physical scheme, there would be various kinds of transitivity principles. So if x is shorter than y and y is shorter than z, then x is shorter than z. So length is subject to various kinds of constitutive principles. In the mental arena, there are also constitutive principles. These are the principles which have to do with the fact that the mental taken as a whole has to make sense. It has to make rational sense.
Right.
So far, so similar perhaps, and yet it's the disparate commitments which are the key to the argument. So I wonder if you could say something about that, which is perhaps the part of the article that people find the hardest.
Of course, and so do I. But the analogy, as you put it, seems to me to break down transitivity of preference, transitivity of length. We've got in both cases some sort of holism in the sense that these principles are both descriptive and constitutive, and a way of putting that is to say, we better not ask whether these principles are analytic or synthetic. The things that have to fit together in the case of the mental have a propositional content. And fitting them together means fitting the propositional contents together. Now, there's nothing like that in physics. When we do physics, we don't treat the objects as if they had propositions in them. So there's a kind of fitting involved in the mental that isn't involved at all in the physical sciences. I mean, we don't treat minds or we don't treat stars, let's say, or electrons as if they were thinking something. We don't attribute propositional contents to them or to any of their properties. I say we don't. I mean, I don't. Most people don't. So the analogy isn't perfect. But let me. You want to know why I believe in the failure of reduction here, and I won't put it quite as I did in the article because I've thought about it since. But it's not unconnected with what I said there. I now think there are three things to say. They're related to each other. The first one is I'm convinced that psychological concepts have the concept of cause built into them, and built into them in a way where you can't get rid of it. For example, I think the notion of an action is something which is caused by beliefs and values that the agent has, which explain the action. We do lots of things under descriptions where you can't explain them that way, but there will be an explanation of that kind. I mean, if I accidentally sit down on my hat, there's no rationalizing that because I didn't intend to do it and I didn't even know I was doing it until too late. But nevertheless, I sat down on purpose, and that's what makes it an action. The intention accounts for the action, and you can explain the action in the ways that we do explain such things in terms of what I wanted and what I believed and so forth. Now, causal concepts like action, or for that matter, belief. Belief is partly a causal notion. If you believe something, you will be caused to act in certain ways given certain circumstances. In that respect, it's a disposition like solubility, let's say. Solubility, that is a causal concept. Slippery, it's a causal concept. Something slippery, if it will cause things to slip under certain circumstances. The difference comes out in the following way. These physical dispositions, we assume we don't have to use. We can get rid of them as science progresses. If we want to explain why something dissolves, for example, we no longer have to just say, well, it was soluble, that's why it dissolved. Rather, we look for an explanation of that, and when we get finished, the notion of solubility will be no part of the explanation. Because we'll be able to say, look, anything that has this kind of internal structure and so forth is going to do so-and-so under these circumstances. That's a law. We don't have to talk about what it would do if. We just say it does do so-and-so under these conditions. And we've, in a way, uncovered the mechanism that accounts for things dissolving under certain circumstances. Now, why is that advantageous in science? Well, because the notion of something being soluble, using solubility as an explanation, which, by the way, is perfectly okay. There's nothing wrong with it. But it leaves out something that could be explained. It takes for granted. And, you know, most of our practical knowledge of physical objects depends upon our knowledge of their dispositions, what they will do if something. And sometimes we can go behind that, and often most of us can't. But it's an aim of science to get rid of that, because you get imperfect laws as long as you have to use these disposition concepts. I mean, Russell was right when he said an advanced science doesn't use causal concepts. Perhaps he put it slightly differently. Maybe he said causality drops out. But I don't say that. I just say causal concepts drop out, which is quite a different thing to say.
So advanced science talks about the bases of the dispositions rather than just talking about the dispositions.
Yes, and when you do that, you don't have to rely on the notion of cause. It doesn't mean that the final laws of physics can't be called causal laws. I don't see any reason not to. But they don't mention causality.
And now there's going to be a disanalogy, I take it, with the mental case.
There is a disanalogy, yes, because I think there's no getting rid. I mean, if we want to do ordinary psychology, we want to talk about things that people do. And we want to talk about their actions, among other things. Here, both the thing to be explained, the action, putting down the glass, is causal in the sense that it wouldn't be an action even if it weren't caused by explaining beliefs and desires that explain it. And I don't see any way to get rid of that element of causality without changing the subject. And the things we use to explain it, beliefs. Well, my belief that if I put the glass down, it will stop at a certain point, namely when it gets to the table, it is part of the explanation of why I moved as I did. But that belief already is a causal, among other things. It's a causal concept because that's the kind of, and it wouldn't be the belief it is if it weren't the kind of belief that would cause me to act as I do, given what I want. So there's causality built into most of the major concepts inside.
So in the mental, if I understand this, in the mental arena, the terms that we use like beliefs are in certain respects analogous to dispositional terms in the physical sciences.
Yes.
But whereas in the physical sciences we can, within the same project,
Right.
without losing sight of the topic,
Right.
we can move to the basis
Right.
of the disposition.
Right.
But the idea is that in the mental arena, for all that these dispositions presumably have bases, when you move to the basis of the disposition, you lose sight of the idea of an agent, of a person, of a thinker, of somebody with beliefs, and
That's
so on.
right, yes. The kind of explanation that we're looking for when we want to explain why people acted as they did would just drop out.
Well, I found that very illuminating. When you began that little bit of discussion, you mentioned there were actually three new things you had to say, and I think that was just the first of them. What were the other two?
Yes, I just say about that the one that I began with, I don't think that's in the original article. The second one, and as I said, these are all related to each other. But the second one is the normative, what I call the normative element in psychological concepts. By the normative element, I don't mean something about what we ought to do, or even how we ought to think. The normative element just comes from the fact, and maybe that's not the right word for it, but it just comes from the fact that in explaining, understanding, describing, thinking, and acting, we're all the time dealing with propositional contents, people intended to make something the case. Some people believe that something is the case. They want something to be the case. All of those are what everybody tends to call propositional contents, whether they believe in propositions or not. And those, on the one hand, we're treating things that have a propositional content as causes and effects. But on the other hand, we're also we have to bear in mind what the contents are, because they our beliefs and desires wouldn't explain what we do if it weren't for the fact that the belief has this content. I mean, I believe that the glass will stop when it gets to the surface of the table, and without that content, it wouldn't explain why I put the glass where I did. So we're fighting, or not fighting, but let's say we're doing two things at once. We're keeping track of causal relations, and we're keeping track of logical relations. That is the necessary logical relations between the contents of our thoughts and the things we do, without which our psychological explanations wouldn't explain what we want to understand.
Might I just ask something about that? That when you said that normativity, as you're using the term, has to do just with the existence of content and not with an ought. But there is an idea which is more like an ought, the idea of something being the thing to think given what else you think, or something being the thing to do given what you think and what you value. And one thing that's quite interestingly disanalogous between the mental arena and, for example, the issue of lengths and the transitivity principle is that for all there is this logical constraint of transitivity, this doesn't seem to give rise to any idea such as, well, the length for this to have would be.
Right.
Whereas in the mental arena, we do, I think, have this idea that the logical relations, such as entailment relations between propositions, do get projected into the psychological arena and give us the thing to think is, for example, Q, given that you already think if P then Q and you think that P. Now, for all that you said that you weren't concerned with the ought, is this something that you would accept as part of the picture?
Yes, that's fine. And if you explain the ought in that way, I think it's perfectly right. I mean, psychological explanations show to what extent it was reasonable for somebody to do what they did. Given what they thought, given what they wanted, it was reasonable at least up to a point. I mean, there are all kinds of irrationality that need to be explained, but they have to be explained in the face of this fact, namely that a certain we wouldn't be giving a psychological explanation if we didn't see from the explanation for ourselves why it was reasonable, up to a point anyway, for the person to do what they did. I mean, it might have been foolish for me to think that the table would stop the glass. It might have been absurd for me to want to get rid of the glass. But given that I did believe what I did, and that I did want what I did, it was reasonable for me to act as I did.
I was wondering if we might, although I realise we're still only on the second of 3 points that you wanted to make, if we might just move from these considerations to a question which I've been wanting to ask you, which is about the nature of the explanation that we have. Let's take a mental-to-mental causal transaction.
Right.
So let's take the case where somebody comes to believe something because of a bunch of standing values that they have, they now decide to do something. They decide that something is the thing to do. And there's a causal transaction there, and there's also the possibility, as you've been saying, of explaining what they do, and the notion of content is vital. And we've been talking a little bit about a certain kind of ought which can creep into the picture. Mm-hmm. So the question arises, is this explanation when we say, well, the reason why this person decided to do such and such is, well, they just come to believe so and so, and they have these standing values. When we offer those kinds of explanations, these are a quite different kind of explanation from the more familiar subsumption under a causal generalization kind of explanation, or whether they are just subsumption under a causal generalization because, after all, you've said that there are these non-strict causal laws in the psychological case. And there's a very familiar quotation from John McDowell that I thought I might just read out, where he says that the concepts of the propositional attitudes have their proper home in explanations of a special sort, explanations in which things are made intelligible by being revealed to be, or approximate to being, as they rationally ought to be. And the contrast is with the more familiar style of explanation in which one makes things intelligible by representing their coming into being as an instance of, well, this is how things tend to happen. So what do you say about the kind of explanation that is used when we explain decision or action in terms of belief and value? Is it a special kind of explanation, quite unlike causal subsumptive, this is the way the world tends to work kind of explanation? Or is it just an instance of that, but an instance which uses these psychological non-strict generalizations?
No, it has special character, obviously, and that's due to the fact that the notion of reasonableness comes into it, whereas it doesn't come into ordinary causal laws. That doesn't mean, of course, that these aren't causal, but it means they've got something else in addition.
So would the right model be to see these as explanations which work by subsumption under a causal generalization, but they also shed a further light as well, which would not be quite to say that they're an utterly different kind of explanation, but an explanation with some, so to speak, value added? Or would you, in fact, take the more dramatic position that these are really quite unlike explanation by subsumption under a generalization?
Well, these are generalizations that include the reference to the contents of the thoughts. So that is a complete difference from what you get in the natural sciences. On the other hand, that's not any reason to say that they aren't causal generalizations. They are, and I don't mind calling them laws. The thing is that they will be the kind of accomplish their purpose only if they reveal the action as intelligible. That is reasonable given certain aspects of the situation, and reasonableness simply is no element in physical explanation.
Right. Just perhaps rounding that point off, would it be possible for there to be generalizations which make use of notions of content, non-strict generalizations, of course, which do not carry with them the idea of this being the reasonable thing to do? Might there be a generalization that, on the whole, people who want such and such badly enough end up believing it's true? Nothing rational about that, but if there was a true generalization, perhaps people who are in such and such circumstances or who have ingested such and such substances want something badly enough, believe that it's true, there would appear to be the possibility of generalization using these content terms, but not bringing in this extra consideration of reasonableness. Now, is that something which is admissible on your picture of psychological explanation?
Yes, and in fact, it's inevitable because irrationality requires that mental states be pushed around, so to speak, caused to be one way or another, but not in the category of reasonableness. And one belief or can push another one around, sometimes very much to our advantage. I mean, we may be thinking one thing, and that may remind us of something we should be doing, and thank goodness it happened. So it's not as though it necessarily led to any disaster, but it's not in the realm of rationality.
So although mental terms may well have their home in a special kind of explanation, they certainly can figure in regular subsumptive explanations. This is the way the world works. People who have these mental states quite often have these other mental states. Okay. Well, Donald, I think that time is against us, and the state of play, as I understand it, is this. We were talking about the crucial premise of anomalism of the mental, and you said that there were three things that you would like to say more, and I think we're going to have to leave the third of those hanging. We've been talking about the first two, and the point that we reached, I think, was this, that there can be explanation in the psychological arena, which is causal subsumptive explanation without any rationalization, where the generalizations nevertheless use mental terms and use the notion of content. So perhaps we could just put down as a marker for future discussion in this series the idea that if there are these generalizations, psychological though non-strict, which can cover a particular causal transaction, does that in any way undermine another premise in the argument, the premise of the nomological character of causation? That premise said that wherever there's a particular causal transaction, there must be a strict law which covers it. Now, what we now have is, well, there could be psychological laws which would cover a transaction, though they would not be strict. Right. And now we would need to know why there must, in addition, be a strict law, for it's going to be on that the argument for monism will now turn.
Yes, I agree. And that's to look to the second premise, which I haven't defended yet, and it's perhaps the most dubious of the three, and we'll get to discuss it later.